Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to congratulate the organizers of this summer school. I looked at the program. I think you have really cool days ahead of you. I looked at all the workshops. It looks really, really interesting. So congratulations for putting this program together. And thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to this event. Yes, I'm going to report today about Impresso project, interdisciplinary collaborative project with, between Luxembourg and Switzerland, where we applied semantic enrichment, natural language processing techniques to historical newspapers from Switzerland and Luxembourg. And what's important to say, first off, is that I'm just one member of this team. So we are a big group of people. A lot of conversations have taken place in the last 5 years. A lot of ideas have been exchanged in the last 5 years. So I'm just one representative of a larger group and do my best to compress, digest, and present what we've been up to in the last 5 years. Before we start, however, I think it makes sense to take a moment and think about the value of historical newspapers, especially for historical research. It's commonly said that newspapers are mirrors of past societies, that they reflect the sentiments, the norms, the values of the past, and that we can use them so as primary sources, as mirrors to get a sense of how past societies have experienced their day-to-day lives, how they have reflected on the events that shaped their times. And this is adequate, of course, but there's another dimension to this that we need to keep in mind, and that is the dimension of those who created these newspapers in the first place. So what we obtain is somehow tinted through their views, through their political agenda, through their religious interest, through whichever future they wait, which future and presence they wish to shape through the power that they had available through their medium. And for me, this intersection between capturing some of a zeitgeist of the past and the lens, the agency, the interest of those who created the newspapers, that's what makes them interesting for me as a historian to work on them. But of course, there's many other facets to study historical newspapers in terms of language change over time, in terms of the evolution of newspapers as a medium that has gaining images, that is changing its layout, that is changing its categories. Look for the representation of art and culture through the newspapers. So there's many, many applications to study historical newspapers. However, in this first part, I want to reflect a bit on our lessons learned on first entering this field of digital historical newspapers. And I would like to pitch it as an uneven landscape that we encounter when we start these kind of computer science history research projects. The first thing what we're going to do throughout this talk is to play around a bit with a case study. This is a new research project of mine looking at the history of nuclear power. If we wanted to start such a project, what we do right now is we go to any of the portals that national libraries, but also newspaper institutions have created in the past. And we're going to start with the keyword search. I chose here the German term Atomkraftwerk, nuclear power plant. And what we do is we look at the set of results. Perhaps we apply some filters for time periods. Sometimes we can also filter by content or adverts already. And then we inspect the results we get. In this instance, we are at 1,300. Save some PDFs, put them on a hard drive, and continue. So more or less, today, this is our way to go. But of course, we want to go further. And if you want to go further, we need to understand in which landscape we're moving. What we see here is very much the tip of a large hidden iceberg. What we see pictured on this chart is the number of titles of digitized newspapers aggregated by world region, published already in 2015. So this is a little bit older, but what we see is really the very tip of the iceberg, a small digital sample of all the newspapers that have been cataloged in libraries in the first place, those that have been selected for digitization following policies that are not always transparent by individual institutions, So for example, there's the dimension of preservation, what we need to keep, but also of public interest, what are the key titles we want to make available. But sometimes, and if you're lucky as a researcher, you can also sneak in your own titles in there and make sure they get preferential treatment through digitization. Beneath this iceberg is a first layer of all the titles that are in the archives, in the library, that have not been digitized yet and maybe never will be digitized because they're not considered to be interesting or important. So this is the knowable part of the iceberg. Below that is the unknowable part of the iceberg. This is all historical newspaper titles that have been in circulation in the past, but no one ever bothered, cared, or was interested to archive them in the first place. And this is the bit that causes headaches. There's some research, for example, by David Smith, Northeastern University, who's attempting to get a sense of what this second layer of the hidden iceberg could have looked like, to get a sense of how representative this small sample that we have on top actually is for our study of the past. Really hard problem, really difficult, but we need to be aware that we are dealing with a very small proportion of everything there was. Once a newspaper title has passed digitization, it is available. That does, of course, not mean at all that it is actually accessible for us to conduct research on it. All the partners we have dealt with are operating with a copyright deadline, so titles enter the public domain 70 years after an author has died. The big problem with newspapers is who is the author, and how do we know that this person has died, that the claims to this content that was produced have expired in the first place. And naive as I was when we started this project, I thought this is going to be some standard policies. It's going to be very easy to figure out which titles we can put online and which not. But the reality is that every institution came up with their own risk assessment of these titles, what they can put outside, what they can share with researchers, and what not. So some institutions are more bold and turn it around and say, we make a risk assessment based on who could possibly sue us if we put the content online, and others play it more safe and go back 100 or 120 years just to make sure no one could put a lawsuit on them. So there we have the first dimension of unevenness, variability in the content. OCR, especially for everyone in the historical domain, must be quite high on the list of problems that we think about when we start thinking of historical newspapers. But if you talk to computer scientists, they will say that OCR as a problem is solved. Today's tools work so well, there's no major headache involved anymore in processing historical newspapers. And while this may be true from the computer science side, it is certainly not true from the library side. What I put here on the slides is an experiment that my colleague Simon Klimatide and his team from the University of Zurich have undertaken. What we see here is a small snippet from Neue Zürcher Zeitung. On the left we see the original OCR as it came out in 2005, and it's completely unreadable, so we can't really make sense of it. They compared that to OCR from 2017, which is quite a bit better, but still, if you think of conducting any analysis of this, of conducting keyword search, still really, really tricky. And then what they've done is they trained training materials in handwriting recognition using the Transkribus platform with relatively small number of pages. I think it was 500 pages, if I recall well. And the output is absolutely phenomenal. We have a huge boost in quality. And in this experiment, we can show that indeed, in theory, OCR problems are a thing of the past. But talking from the library perspective, it's incredibly costly, of course, to re-OCR all their collections every few years as quality is growing and improving. So there we have a major mismatch where in theory we could solve OCR. In practice, we see a huge degree of variations in OCR quality. And that for us as researchers puts another challenge, since it's really hard to assess where's the good OCR and where's the poor OCR. So if you want to assess what we can find in a corpus, where we can run decent analysis, it's really not trivial to figure out where the good bits are and where the bad bits are. We have a quite similar situation when we speak of segmentation. It's definitely not a solved problem. There's a lot of ongoing research, but this is another field where different institutions have pursued different policies over time. So with some newspaper portals, you will be able to filter your search down to adverts only. You'll be able to filter, for example, in Luxembourg, to death notices only. So we have very fine-grained segmentation of the contents, is super specific. And for other titles we have received, all we have is a scan, a PDF, and that's it. So if you make a keyword search for Spanish flu, you may get a result where one article speaks of the Spanish language and the other one speaks of a flu outbreak, just because we can't distinguish which article, where we have this occurrence of keywords specifically. So when we take a step back and reflect on this landscape, we have multiple layers of processing. Each of them causes some degree of variability, may cause its own problems and challenges in there. That begins with the process of archive and cataloging, scanning in the libraries, the processing internal to the institutions. For us, as a research project, another source of potential error was during the transfer, the re-ingestion of content, and even now today in the display, wherever we pull content via IIIF protocol, we from time to time get errors as well, need to adjust. So there's many layers which can cause noise problems, biases, and variations in the process line. And what you see here pictured is our attempt to document at least some of this complexity, to be open and transparent about the problems that can occur in this process of processing. So what we do is indicate in the top bar, you see this red line at the very top, to indicate the mismatch between theoretically existing newspaper pages in this instance, according to the metadata, and those that we actually have on record. So in some years, this will go up to 6% of mismatch between theoretically existing newspaper pages and those we actually have received from our partners. And below you see the blue lines and the red lines. This is the relationship between print run, as indicated in newspapers, and titles actually available to us in the form of data. This is a long way to go to break the myth of the perfect digital archive. So as scholars, we need to be quite aware of these heterogeneities, of these variations and biases, which is something we put quite some emphasis on in our project. Now, if we sum up the landscape, the challenging, uneven landscape of historical newspapers can be characterized by 5 points. We have institutional silos. It is hard to share data between them to get access to it. Whichever data we have is not only a small sample, but it is still really big and really messy, with variations in standards and processing policies and guidelines. Whatever text we have tends to be noisy. We don't always know how that quality is distributed within our title. And now speaking more from the historical side of things, we're still in the process of learning how we can explore, interact with this kind of data, how we can, for example, use visualizations, data science methods to help us explore. And what is ongoing is to develop new forms of digital scholarship on this kind of data to really exploit the opportunities that are offered by this data. And there, Jani Marjan, I'm sure, will give a great lecture of his work that I think is one of the really nice and shining examples of how we can overcome all these challenges and still do great work. But things are changing. So this is the point of this talk where things are moving from gloom to more happy. We're looking more at opportunities. What has happened in the last few years is the libraries are coming around. We have this notion of collections as data. I can point to this recently compiled, co-written book, Open a Glam Lab, that serves as something like a how-to operation to open up your library data for research, for computational data-driven research. And our colleagues at Luxembourg did something really nice by offering packages of their newspaper data sets for different purposes, for different audience. So we have the 250 megabyte starter pack with CC0, so public domain content, ready for you to start exploring, to get a sense of what the images look like, what the XML looks like, for your first experimentation with historical newspapers. Then there's the 3 gigabyte sample for those who wish to explore working with big data. And then finally, the 1 gigabyte sample pack that gives you an overview of all the variations they have in their newspaper collections. So if in the course of the day you're looking for some nice data sets to run your analysis, to test your code, I can recommend this. The other thing that has been changing is the modus operandi of conducting research on digitized cultural heritage, especially newspapers. We have the inevitable rise of the Jupyter Notebook, which is omnipresent. Here I'd like to point specifically to the workbench published by Trove, the Australian aggregator of digital cultural heritage. They've created an environment that you can start in your browser, start to code right away on their data using API access, and offer a variety of new lenses, new perspectives on the data that they have. And here on the right, I put a nice example from the Cervantes library that is basically an overview, a repository of different notebooks that have been published in the past that can serve as teaching instruments to show you how other persons have approached a specific question. The idea is that you copy it, tweak it, make it your own, make it work on your own data. So if anything, what we see is this is the way forward for future scholarship on digitized historical newspapers. What also has been happening in the last few years is, of course, Impresso project and a number of sister projects all related to the study of historical newspapers. So my colleague Yanni was in the NewsEye project, and maybe he will talk a little bit about it as well tomorrow, I don't know. Ongoing is Living with Machines, looking at a variety of British newspaper and other serialized sources and the idea of semantic enrichment of them, computational analysis of these kind of data, and Oceanic Exchange is focused on transnational flows of media between Europe and the United States. Now a few words on Impresso project. The guiding question that we had is, how can semantic enrichments enhance the study of digital historical newspapers? And this question was raised from 3 perspectives. The first is that of natural language processing. The second is that of design, front-end software design. And the third is that from history, of course. Impresso was funded by, as part of a 3-year project by the Swiss National Science Foundation. Partners were EPFL Lausanne, the University of Zurich, especially the Institute for Computational Linguistics, and my center, the Luxembourg Center for Contemporary and Digital History. We had the good fortune to partner up with 2 national libraries, those of Switzerland and Luxembourg, who offered their data sets to us based on some legal agreements which were complex but ultimately feasible to put into place, together with individual titles, NZZ for German-speaking Switzerland and Le Temps for French-speaking Switzerland, together with a number of smaller archives. So this is what constitutes our corpus. In total, for now, 76 newspaper titles written in German, French, and Luxembourgish. I mentioned already, Impresso is a collaborative project, and what we learned quite quickly is that we have to really put all our competencies and interests to the table to work together effectively. So in this group, we have computational linguists, we have historians, developers, digital humanities experts, engineers, media historians. So really the idea was to capture a lot of different perspectives on this topic in order to move forward and to create something that would be beyond the expertise and beyond the abilities of any individual disciplines. So in this project, there's no master-slave relationship between computer science and history, but the ambition was from the start to see eye to eye, to have equal voices in this project. That is also expressed in 3 sub-research questions. How do we adapt NLP tools to perform best as they can on historical text? How can we explore this complex and vast amounts of data? I went on for quite a bit on all these complexities that we need to consider when working with there. And then what is the impact of new tooling on digital scholarship in our focus of the project, that is history. The whole process started by collecting the sources based on legal agreements with the libraries, ingesting that, making sure that standards such as Metz Alto were identified. Then we learned that each institution has their own dialect of this standardized Metz Alto metadata format to enrich historical newspapers. So quite a lot of work went into normalizing the standards, cleaning up, putting it into our own canonical file format to actually do the enrichment. And in parallel, we started with the development of an interface, first based on mockups, on a subset of data, and then iteratively between the 3 disciplines, this interface slowly took shape. So basically, the situation where we are now is we have like the idea of the classical interface for historical newspapers. We have this rundown of semantic enrichments available to us, that was produced by our colleagues in Switzerland. And what we need to do is put all this in there. It was quite clear that none of the existing interfaces would do the job. None of them were built to take on, to represent, for example, topic modeling, or text reuse data. So we had to do something from scratch. And the target audience that we're working with is the normal historian, who of course doesn't exist, but the persona for whom we developed this is a researcher, has a degree in history, has no specific digital training or expertise, but is curious to learn something new, is curious to go beyond his or her comfort zone. So we're aiming right above the head of the average historian, also challenging them a little bit to move and to learn, to adapt. We did quite a lot of user workshops. We asked people what they want. And of course, when we ask people what they want from historical newspapers, the answer is perfect OCR and search, which was sort of expected, but not really what we wanted to have out of these user workshops. So we formulated a number of scenarios. I put 2 examples here of interesting things to do that could not be resolved with a simple keyword search and simple filtering operations. So these scenarios helped us to really challenge a bit our common ways of interacting with newspapers, going beyond keyword search, and to really rethink how we can put these catalog of semantic enrichments of newspapers to our users. As part of these exchanges, we produced regularly these kind of mock-ups. I put a little photo here, and we asked people to really align them with their expectations of how things work, asked them to comment them, took in this feedback, and processed it for further. And we're not going to go through the details here, but this is the rundown of events that we organized just to make sure that we are not isolated in the development of this interface, that we stay in constant exchange with our target user groups, that we present early on what we're doing, what we're thinking of doing to get feedback, to make sure we are caught early on, should we move in the wrong direction or should we do something that would go against the perceived needs of this group of people, and more. So what came from all these intense exchanges? I would say there's 4 high-level objectives that we've identified. The first, perhaps not so surprising, is efficient and effective search. Help me discover relevant content, beyond keyword search in our case. Second, overview and focus. Help me process a large number of results. Quite often we're overwhelmed with 30,000, 40,000, 100,000 hits for a given query. How can we make sense of that? How can we figure out what's actually in there in these large number of results that we can't possibly read ourselves? Third, data and tool criticism. Help me understand what I'm working with. Give me a sense of this iceberg that I introduced at the very beginning. Give me a sense of how these fancy NLP tools work. What do I need to know of these tools to understand the output I'm getting? And fourth, comparative perspectives. Help me contextualize what I find. What does that mean? What does a X number of results mean in terms of historical impact that a given newspaper had? We mentioned already Codesign, very important. I was thinking a bit of how to capture or illustrate these interactions we had with our colleagues, and I came up with a reverse Pong idea. So we have computer science and history on the left, on the right, each playing the ball to each other, making sure that the ball does not go in the off, but that the other one can stretch enough to catch it and to play back. And this is us moving in and out of our comfort zones, challenging each other, pushing each other to rethink and produce something new together. Concrete example are word embeddings, where computer science really pushed to generate word embeddings for different languages. Historians really wanted keyword suggestions. And then we just looked at the raw output. At some point here, we have the more polished feature. And I put in here atom in German as well. And we see all these related terms around them. So this effectively works to expand our choice of keywords, to bring us to our attention potential keywords that we may not have anticipated to use. And here for the French, I put nucléaire. You see a beautiful display of the full spectrum of OCR mistakes that are also washed up through word embeddings. So if you remember, we had the big request to fix OCR, to have the perfect OCR. That we could not do. That was beyond the scope of the project. But what we have here is an effective workaround. We can manage the imperfection of the OCR and still use these wrong suggestions to perform better search queries. After that, it's time to actually look at the interface. It's time for a demo. For that, I'm going to sit down. So this is the Impresso interface. I should also say it's freely accessible to anyone. If you would like to have access to the full data, you need to sign a non-disclosure agreement, send it to us, and then you're going to get a researcher account. What I'm doing is I start with a simple keyword search for Atomkraft, nuclear power. We're going to wait a moment to load, and we find 1,500 articles roughly. And we're going to go back now to the word embeddings to add a few similar terms. So we have nuclear energy, add core breaking, and I'm going to go down the list and not specifically just select a few more for the purposes of this demo. Add a few more keyword searches, and we see we have an instant boost of search results from 1,500 to 12,000 in this instance. As in many other interfaces, we have the rundown of articles, the frequency of articles. We can also see that in percentage and relative proportion to the overall corpus. We have a filter by content length. What is coming soon is a filter by OCR quality, which we have computed. So this is not the perfect solution to OCR, but one approach to do it. We can filter by language, by title. And I'm going to stop here at the collection level. So this is something we found incredibly useful, the ability to store a set of articles that you're interested in. So this can be a dozen or so articles that you pick manually, but it can also be up to 10,000 articles or even more that are the results of a query. But what we have here is a subset of our corpus that matches a certain theme, contains a certain topic that we can set as a filter, search within. We can compare two of these collections. We can also export them for processing outside the interface. And this creation of this research object in form of a collection really found to be one of the most powerful ways to engage with our corpus. Moving on, we have detected persons, but I want to come here to the collections, to the topics that were generated. So per language, we computed 100 topics, and each of these topics again works as a lens or as a filter on the overall search results. And you can see here a German topic: water, operation, work, energy, company. And if I apply this filter, we are halving the number of results. And if you take a closer look at the output, at the articles that are associated with this topic, you get quite a lot of content like this. So this is the popular science perspective on nuclear power. This is engineering light to explain different concepts in nuclear power to different audiences. So this filter is not perfect, but it really offers us different lenses on the topic that we're studying. And we can see how these topics change over time as well. For that, we're going to select this little overlay here. We can see the distribution of articles that scored high with this popular science topic over time, and we can compare it with the overall distribution of the topic in our corpus. We see another topic here, Bundesrat, so the Swiss National Council, Switzerland, the Council Bern. If we select this, we would get a lot of articles discussing the introduction of nuclear power within Switzerland. So yet a different perspective on this topic, a different lens that we can zoom in on and study in greater detail. So this is, we found, a really effective way to get an overview of what is in the search result list, which facets have been identified in our corpus there. The other thing we invested a little bit of time in was image similarity, which is taking a little bit of time to load, but it's coming. I'm going to make a keyword search for the French term nucléaire. Again, we see the iconic image of the cooling, nuclear power cooling tower. We can select for similar images. We see more images of a cooling tower. And if I remove the keyword as well, you can actually see how Gazette de Lausanne and Journal de Genève have chosen to reuse the same image time and time again over quite a long time span. So this was interesting, especially for colleagues of us in media history who are interested in the distribution of images throughout a historical research corpus. Many of you will be familiar with Google Engrams, so we made our own Engram engine for Impresso, for our corpus specifically. And I'm going to do my search for nuclear power again. We see the distribution, and I'm going to compare it with Kernkraft, which, according to all the research, we have they're synonymous, but Atomkraft would specify the position of those in opposition to nuclear power, whereas Kernkraft would favor the position of those who favor nuclear power. I'm not sure if that's true. That's to be confirmed by future research, but we can really see nicely how these two terms change their frequency over time. And again, we can filter down our corpus here and really be specific of searching only in Luxembourgish, searching only in a specific language, searching only in a specific topic, for instance. Another lens or another tool that we found incredibly useful to do was the comparison perspective in there. So we can effectively compare two queries and see where they overlap. So I'm going to very quickly make a query for nuclear bomb here to see how nuclear power coverage in the newspapers compares and relates to coverage surrounding nuclear weapons. Can just very briefly add a few more similar terms. And we can see with this very brief initial query, we already find 2,100 articles which overlap in this instance. With a click on this button here, we can go back to search and inspect all these articles that are overlapping here. We can save them as a new collection, for example, export them for following research. And in addition, just to show you briefly, we are available to add a large number of additional filters. So we can get very specific on tailoring and fine-tuning these kind of queries and these contrastive comparative views. Another recurrent topic in our exchanges was the idea of intertextuality, so the flow of content within a newspaper corpus. So we invested quite some resources in text reuse detection. Again, I'm going to do it on a simple keyword search and identify 2 clusters here. I don't want to spend too much time here, but what I found striking and remarkable is that when we have, for example, the report from a press agency that was redacted, that was changed by an editor, it is still being picked up by text reuse. So it's not identical text that we were finding, but really, if the core has been changed and tweaked, we still can pick it up. With a click in close reading mode, we can inspect it once again. And you see here, these bars on the right side, already in close reading mode, indicate that this passage that you're looking at in an article has been published, or a similar passage has been published somewhere else in the corpus, and with a click, you can go back and inspect it. The last thing I'd like to show you is the overview of collections. So this is all the collections I have created over the last few years. You get these nice overviews of what is in there once again. So what is the distribution of languages? What are the top named entities? What are the top topics and locations, etc. And again here, there's the option to export this data for further processing outside the interface. The other small thing I would like to alert to you is these eye icons that you can see here. So throughout the process of developing this interface, it was clear that we need to educate our users, that we need to explain what we're doing. We need to explain what is topic modeling, what is text reuse, what do we see on any given chart, how does that work? And that's why we created these miniature information eye buttons, and with a click on more information, we are entering the frequently asked questions segment, where we do our best to give accessible information to explain a given functionality, link out to additional content that explains the choices we made in terms of processing, developing this interface, just to make it as easy as possible for users to understand the tools we have been developing and to understand the choices we have made as a project along the way. We're going to continue. So, positioning Impresso, what did we do? From my point of view, which is of course heavily biased, but we have built an effective tool for advanced search exploration and discovery of newspaper data for historians that is not limited only to Swiss and Luxembourgish newspapers. We have become quite good at offering the tools to help researchers build a corpus, so to identify the sub-collection of content as large as it should be. So it can be a dozen articles, it can be 10,000 for normal users, and to facilitate an effective bridge between close and distant reading operations in the process of doing so. We have also opened up multiple new entry points into our corpus. We can search by topic, we can search by a named entity, we can do the classic keyword search and expand it. This is all different angles into this enriched newspaper corpus, and as I just showed you with the eye buttons, this is just one of the ways we have sought to implement accessible information that allows you to critically reflect on what you're doing. And for everything else that Impresso does not cover, because we are not the one tool to rule everything, to run any thinkable data analysis on newspapers, we really push to have a CSV export of the data that includes the metadata and the full text, depending on the legal situation, but to allow people to make it as easy as possible to do the rest of their analysis outside Impresso interface. Now, part 4, making sense of Impresso. Many of you will know the story of Croesus and his interactions with the Delphi oracle. Just as a quick recap, Croesus, king of the Lydians, considered going to war against the Persians, and after some iterations he identified a suitable oracle to advise him on this. And when he put one of his aides there to ask, the answer was, you will destroy a great empire if you attack Persia. As in an instance of confirmation bias, Croesus went ahead, attacked Persia, and of course destroyed his own empire as a consequence. Now, what can we learn from this? The first, be mindful of confirmation bias. And the second, and this relates more directly to Impresso, but I would say to any other similar interfaces, to any similar form of data analytics, which question exactly do we answer with the queries that we put into Impresso? So we did, in the last few years, quite a lot of one-to-one demos of the interface, did a lot of workshops teaching people how to use it. And if there's one problem that stood out to me regularly was people jumping to conclusions, finding in the frequency charts the pattern that they would have liked to see, building wide-ranging, highly impactful historical theories based on some article counts that they see, whilst throwing out all the skepticism and the academic rigor that is usually part of historical training, throwing all this out in the process of doing so. So what we really need to come back to is this idea of skepticism, to ask which question exactly do we answer, what is exactly the answer that we're getting, and what should we consider before drawing conclusions and interpreting it. I go very briefly here. We offered a number of educational materials ranging from beginner level, which is published in the learning platform Ranke 2, where we have videos and lessons just to introduce these basic notions of what is a digitized historical newspaper, what do we need to keep in mind when we start interacting with this source. Ranging to intermediate level, so this is digitized newspapers for researchers, so you're an established researcher, you want to make sense of it, what are the things you should be aware of, what should you keep in mind when you start conducting research on that. For the project internal choices, we kept a blog where we explained and introduced forms of semantic enrichment such as named entity processing, topic modeling, text reuse, word embeddings to our audience, which again is the highly motivated and interested historical researchers, but also documented our own choices. For example, the number of topics we set, for example, the pre-processing before we did topic modeling. We just looked at the I buttons and the frequently asked questions. So there the idea is to be as close to the user in the interface as we possibly can, to put the hurdle to learn or the bar as low as we possibly can. But of course, we can't force anyone to go through and read these materials. Another thing I like to point to is the Impresso challenges. So if you get a new router at home, for example, you have this big piece of paper that shows you where to put the different cables, right? This is the idea applied to our interface. So based on images, based on a little bit of text, we show you here the advanced workflows of interacting with the system to make the most of it, and again, to go beyond the simple keyword search. We did the first round of a review, of an evaluation with 10 people with different backgrounds in history and libraries. We got very good results for the search. And then we got a little bit more nuanced feedback when it came to word embedding, engrams, and topics, which we took to heart, but topics especially emerged as the thing that separated our audience a little bit. Some loved it and wanted to have more, wanted to have the ability to generate their own topics, and for others it was just a bit too slippery and they wanted to stay clear of it. The last thing to highlight here is, again, we had a split reaction where some wanted to go more Google, so more keyword suggestions, just a simple search bar, less tools, less options, less choices, and the others wanted actually us to add more complexity, to add more versatility in there, and yeah, we'll leave it there. I'm coming very much to the end. Just for those who are on the data science track already, who are interested in the data, to point you to the Impresso components that are published already. So all the code is available under an AGPL3 license, so this is as open as we possibly could have gone with this. There's a lot of NLP resources available as well. On the corporate benchmarks, we go a bit faster. If you want to learn more about the project, please go to the left URL. If you want to try out the app, register an account, go to the right. If you want to have access to the API for your stuff, send us an email. We'll try to make that work for you as well. Finally, this is the outlook for the future. Before, I spoke a lot of the challenges and the uneven landscape, but in there, I see 3 ground opportunities as well. We can work and move towards interlinked collections, and we're not the only ones who are interested to break these institutional silos and to have one large data set available. We can work on infrastructures and standards for the aligned enrichment and segmentation of these contents. And overall, what we want to go and where we want to go in the future is to offer shared access points for data-driven research beyond all these restrictions we've looked at before. If you're interested in conducting a PhD in history and data science, please go to this website. And if you want to approach me afterwards, so we are offering 7 of these positions in Luxembourg at the moment, with more to follow. This is my last slide. Thank you very much for your attention. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thanks.